Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Every Day with Ron Stasko. I'll be honest, I didn't think I was going to get this one in today. It's day 24, and this month has been a grind, personally. We've had a number of projects, and one that's a very large project with a very hard deadline. And we'll actually be finishing that up tomorrow morning. But we are going to meet the deadline. We were hoping to finish early. We were hoping to finish today, but it didn't happen. And I'm just thankful. I'm thankful that we're at the finish line and we're that close. But I am wore out between that, the other projects, and the flu. I'm still not feeling well. I can't hear out of this ear. I'm taking some medication still and just trying to hang in there. But I wanted to talk about Joseph, because we're getting into that section of Genesis about Joseph's life. I often said that if I had wrote a book about my life, it would be called Me and My Two Best Friends, Joseph and Job. And these two men are probably the two men I relate most to in the Bible, maybe followed up by Joshua. But I am going to read chapters 38 through 40 in Genesis, and then Mark chapter 15 for today's Your Will Be Done Ministries YWBD 2020 Bible Walk. This is the story of Judith and Tamar. Chapter 38 in Genesis. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hariah. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who he named She conceived again and gave birth to a son named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kizib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord put him to death. Judah said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as your brother-in-law, to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he would spill his seed on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the eyes of the Lord. So God put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep. And his friend Hariah the Dulamite went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear the sheep," she took off of her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her, and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived here, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road to Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitutes here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result she is now pregnant. Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I would not give her my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had a scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. Perez means breaking out, and Zerah means scarlet. So that story right there is actually the story of Judah, one of the sons of Israel, and how he got married, had some sons, gave them to this woman, and they wouldn't do their duty, so God put them to death. And then he wouldn't do his duty in giving his third son to her because he was afraid he'd die too. So she tricked him into thinking she was a prostitute, got pregnant by him, and then he's thinking, well, she needs to be put to death if she's being a prostitute. She's supposed to marry my son. And then he realizes that he's the fool, and she's more righteous than him because she honored the oath by becoming pregnant by a member of the family. And then she gave birth to twins. Now back to Joseph, my dude. Genesis 39. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, was one of the Pharaoh's officials. The captain of the guard brought him from the Ishmaelites and taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. He lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all of he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left everything in Joseph's care, everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except what food he ate. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in this house. Everything he owns he has entrusted in my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her, or even be with her. One day he went into the house attending his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew was brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until her master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. All right. Genesis chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer to the king and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup into his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show kindness to me. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given him a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the baskets on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh away." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of the officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into the hand of Pharaoh. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph said to them in the interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Well, that sucks. It's nothing like giving somebody positive report from God and they leave you hanging when you're in need yourself. Here's a young man that he has the favor of the Lord. People see it all around him. Leaders see it. Their houses are blessed because of it. They take full advantage of it. They put him in charge of everything so they don't have to worry about nothing. He gets accused falsely of doing something when he was being righteous. Gets thrown in prison. The guy in prison sees that, hey, this was Potiphar's right-hand man. He's done everything right there. I see the favor of the Lord on him too. He puts him in charge of the prison. He's basically the associate warden of the prison. And these guys basically can kick back with their feet up and choose what they want to eat, and that's all they got to worry about. And they got this guy doing all the work for them. I really associate with that in my life. I've done that for years. For other people. But He also can interpret dreams. I've been fortunate enough to be able to interpret dreams and words of meaning, and been thankful to be able to share things with people from time to time. Good stuff here. Let's read Mark chapter 15. Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pontius Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. "The chief priests accuse you of many things." So again, Pilate asked them, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner from whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in an uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Pilate asked the people, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests had stirred up the crowd and had to have Pontius Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with this one that you call the King of the Jews?" "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pontius Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into a place, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of the soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. And they all began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, named Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross for Jesus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him. When the written notice for the charge against him was written, it read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others, but he cannot save himself," they said. "Let this Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, Listen, he is calling Elijah. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard this cry and saw how he died, he said, Surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and the Joses, and Salome. In Galilee these women had followed him and carried him for his needs. Many other women had come up with Jerusalem there as well. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph the Arimathean, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in a linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. When the curtain was torn from the top to the bottom in two pieces, that something that really man could not do, because it was woven in such a way that it could not be split down the middle. This was truly an act of God when he died. But there's a lot there in the crucifixion. The point of it is that this is what happened so that our sins could be forgiven. He was the sacrifice on Passover so that our sins could be passed over and we could have life with God forever and ever. God bless you, and we'll see you next time on Every Day.